All right, folks, welcome all. Welcome back to our 33rd CoreDev call and first of this year. As always, let me just start by sharing some context. These CoreDev calls, they are used for core contributors to present what's been working on and discuss upcoming features and protocol changes with community members like you. So again, thank you all for joining. While there is time for Q&A, I also encourage you to reach out via our forum, Discord, and GitHub. Everything is out in the open, and we do want your feedback. I'll also paste in a link to the Graphs ecosystem calendar in the chat and show notes, so you can subscribe to future calls. And lastly, CoreDev teams also post monthly updates on the forum. So I highly recommend that you all check it out as well. Link in the chat and the nice QR code with a cute dinosaur on the screen. And now agenda. It's quite light today. We have only one topic, but it's a big one. And given how important it is, we do want to ensure we have enough time to present and discuss it with the broader community. So I'm talking about GIP 0070 or 70. It's called Evolving the Graph Protocol Economics, authored mainly by Rem. Well, not mainly, just authored by Rem from EdgeNode. And in a nutshell, Rem will obviously get into the details, but this GIP does propose a series of protocol upgrades to improve the current incentive structure for greater sustainability, efficiency, and value capture. That's how I would share my TLDR on it.
I'll just show you visually what we're talking about. So this is the forum post, Evolving the Graph Protocol Economics. The forum post goes into quite a bit of discussion about participant needs. It's not a repeat of the GIP. And the GIP itself, this is the GIP itself, is what I'll be spending the most time on today. Bad news first. So bad news is, as I said, I can't cover everything. The good news is there is far more detail in the post itself and the protocol and the GRP, sorry. So I do encourage you to read them, but I'll explain a little bit how I'm going to cover things. So the post itself starts talking about the needs of the various participants. And then from those, we establish some goals and the various aspects discussed about those goals. That leads to some principles about how we're tackling this, how we're designing the solution, and some proposals. So if you like, the needs is I'm not going to show them here, but there are a number of different participants like consumers and indexes and gateways covered in quite a bit of depth to really understand how the graph can best serve the needs of everyone collectively. And the purpose of that is really to make sure that it is actually serving the needs of everyone, and also to show how what the proposals I'm making here are actually in the best interest of everyone. I don't think any participant, in my opinion, should feel that they're left out. Now, from that, sort of three major goals emerged, three themes. One, maintaining the network balance. And the reason I say this is because we already have a very good protocol and network, right? What we've achieved is phenomenal. We shouldn't forget that, and we shouldn't lose the aspects of what we already have that led to that success and will still support future success. And those include that there is global balance between how all the incentives work. They are designed to work together, not in isolation. And there were some protocol changes that came up from Horizon and elsewhere, where at first it wasn't clear how this was going to be maintained. As part of this proposal, we're explaining and making sure that's a key goal. The second key goal was enhancing incentive alignment. So really making sure that every participant on the network is incentivized to act in the best overall interests of the network and in terms of providing value for our consumers ultimately. And the third goal is making sure that we're sustaining continuous improvement. I mentioned before, I think what we've achieved is phenomenal. I think if anyone, I suspect everyone here agrees, what we've achieved is not something you could take for granted. At the same time, I'm going to suggest it's a bit like we're just 1% done. I actually think there's so much more we can do. And I think everyone who's working as a CoreDev shares that vision. And we do need to make some adjustments, some evolution to the protocol to support that. Now, at this level of summary, I'm not going into what the aspects are, just sort of give you a little visual. There kind of were two key aspects per goal. And from that, I sort of established some principles. If those are the goals and these are the areas of concern relating to them, how do we go about designing the solution that incorporates all these elements? And I kind of settled on three major design goals. One, synergistic open primitives. If you like, this is carrying on a little bit from the direction that Horizon initiated. The original protocol had quite a fixed view of who all the current users, or a fixed view of what all the current users of the graph were. We're looking at expanding that horizon, sort of rather than having everything tightly coupled, moved more towards loosely coupled components that could be reused. For example, like data services. It's no longer just one data service on the graph. You can now have many data services. We also want to make sure that they support other use cases like the knowledge graph, for example. So that's being done through saying, okay, we make some open primitives that work together, but that don't constrain the potential of the graph. Now, the second principle is consumer value alignment, that for every part of the design, really checking that actually is this aligned with creating value for consumers? There were some gaps historically where certain network activity could happen and be quite well rewarded, even if that network activity did not provide value for customers ultimately. And this is what we want to change and expand. And I do mean expand, that there's an entire value chain really that's contributing to anything that happens on the graph. And we want to make sure that that value chain can be incentivized. Now, the third is moving away from having very fixed parameters and understanding that with all the different things going on in the graph, it's typically local participants who are best judged as to what the balance between supply and demand is for a particular consumer, for example, and so on. And it's become really a core design principle here that the way the protocol works shouldn't be so fixed. It should be allowed to balance. And I'll give a key example here, that if you take a certain curation cut of, in the order of 10% or 9.9% from query fees, that is probably about as reasonable value that as you can pick globally. But individually, for some subgraphs, that'll be far too much. And for some subgraphs, that'll be far too little. And it reduces the efficiency of the protocol, encourages disintermediation, etc. So the new proposals really seek to allow the market to find the right balance in scenarios like that. And based on these principles, kind of answering all the original goals and aspects, there are a number of proposals. So this, if you like, if you wanted a one-page summary, It's only these concepts that I'd have in the one-page summary. What I'm going to now do is I'm going to go into more detail about the aspects. I'm going to explain them in the context of what's happening on the network, and then the proposals of how to resolve that, again, in the context of what's happening on the network. I will apologize in advance. I'm actually, when I say detail, I'm not going to go into very much detail. So I think there'll be a certain class of questions where people say, oh, but I really want to understand the algorithm. And today isn't really the time to answer all the detailed algorithm questions. Today is really presenting this as an overview, seeing if we all agree and align, or if there's any useful feedback. And then in a series of subsequent GRPs, we will go into details of all of those algorithms. So I've already done a little bit of talking, a little quarter way through the meeting. I'll just pause there briefly before I move on to the next section. Do you have any questions at this sort of high level summary? You are a reasonably quiet audience today. I do encourage you to, if you have a question, please do pipe up. Otherwise, I will keep talking, and it might or might not be answering the questions you really have. So let's move on. I've already introduced this a little bit, but the graph protocol, it's holistically coherent and balanced. And this is actually really important. And now I'll show a little bit. A lot of these details will be really basic for some of you, but I think having a little bit of context of what we're talking about helps this discussion. So the network, of course, indexes data, and then it serves data, right? That's an absolute core value proposition of what the graph and our indexer network do today. Of course, this is for the benefit of consumers who pay for this through query fees. But to ensure that the data is actually indexed in the first place, we have curators. They curate on certain currently subgraphs. It'll be broad in the future. The indexes, therefore, allocate some stake and also potentially some delegation. And ultimately, the protocol comes along and issues indexing rewards. Probably most of you are very familiar with that. And the key point here is understanding, like I said, this is all holistic and coherent and balanced, right? That's the way the protocol is designed, with some caveats, which we'll get to. But this is, again, one of the key goals. We want to maintain that network balance. And one of those key aspects of the balance, and you'll see here as I talk through things, I've tried to put little white surrounds around the things that are related to what I'm talking to help you visually see what's going on. But one of the first key things is that issuance is being distributed to maintain indexing and network health. There was a stage of discussion during Horizon and indexing payments, and it wasn't clear with how we might get rid of or change other mechanisms, how this would be maintained. So we do need to make sure that we have a good answer here. Second part here is there are integrated role incentives, right? They work together to balance the network, and this is important. We can't make it just a set of independent mechanisms. So then I'll move on. I'll just briefly point out though that we're introducing indexing fees. We've been talking about it for a while. And I call the person who's paying the indexing fees is the sponsor, by the way. There'll be more detail on how that role works. But this isn't actually included in the initial proposals for that in this overall balance. And that's something we will address as well. But now, moving on to enhancing the incentive alignment. I said it's balanced. However, you've got this highlighted area here, which is where it centers around indexing rewards, right? And you can operate inside this highlighted area and be richly rewarded with indexing rewards without ever serving a query. So you have this disconnected, it's not completely disconnected, but it's also not as strongly connected as it should be, right? Where the consumers pay for query fees to serve data, but an indexer might or might not be targeting that for their income. So the network rewards are not linked to the consumer value delivered. It's probably a couple of key points here. There's the way curation works. Often curation can be done for the purposes of maximizing indexing rewards rather than actually necessarily increasing consumer value. Not always, but we've also seen cases where curation does lead to good outcomes, but the alignment isn't quite right. And the indexing rewards themselves, as I've alluded to, don't necessarily correspond to what's valuable for our consumers, which undermines the entire network, right? It undermines even indexers who are seeking indexing rewards, which we want them to do, because ultimately the value of the indexing rewards is linked to how much value consumers are ultimately getting from the network, and we want to grow that value. The second point I'll say is there are limited incentives for network contribution to consumer value. So this, I'm going to highlight query fees as being an issue here, and actually that query fees kind of took potentially a step backwards with the initial Horizon plans, because it was being made optional and up to the data service developer what was going to happen with query fees. I'm not getting into the proposal side now, but I will say we are going for a much more opinionated framework for how this works, but one that's balanced. Now, query fees, mentioned before a little bit about indexing. That's kind of not connected, so there's an issue there. And there's these three boxes to the right, basically related to things like spaces on the knowledge graph, which we don't support yet, data services, of course, modules, which can be subgraphs or substreams or some other data service, that we don't cater for them all and we don't cater for them equally. And to a large extent, we don't really cater very well for the incentives from either the builder side, so builders being people who define and build and integrate these systems, or from the side of other contributors who might not be building things per se, but they can be contributing and collaborating, whether that's on content or even the support of the whole ecosystem, right? We want our users to be part of a user network and be supported by the ecosystem and be supporting each other in that ecosystem. And it's great because actually we don't really have incentives for that currently. Now I'm going to quickly move on from the enhanced part to the sustaining continuous improvement. There's not that much to say, to show here visually, but there's a couple of key points. One, we want issuance allocation to be well balanced across all of the different things that happen on the network, and this is really important. And we want it to be balanced in a way that allows the network and the ecosystem to grow in scope and to deliver more value. And the second is that as we do this, as we do all of these changes, we want to make sure that we're establishing a long-term model for the network to improve, including, for example, when foundation vesting ends, and the network has to self-sustain from issuance. So that's basically a little walkthrough of what the aspects or the goals were that are identified. You can see I've turned a few boxes red. The red boxes are where there's some issues to resolve. Before I start going into the proposal side, do you have any questions, or are you still happy to just keep listening?
Keep listening. Is the answer. We're all eager to know more.
Great. Let's keep going then. So I again group the proposals into the same buckets of maintain, enhance, and sustain. The mapping is not actually that strict. These all interrelate. It's an integrated system, but still, some of them apply more than others. So I have grouped them this way. Well, the first thing is it's being proposed to distribute issuance to subsidize the network, to subsidize the indexing as network payments and network rewards. So here there's a little box being introduced that wasn't there before. I'll call that network payments. And then the second one, what we were calling indexing rewards, is now being called network rewards. Now here I will pause a little bit. I'll explain a little bit more the concepts, but I will note today's presentation can't really go into detail of that. That will be a future presentation and a future GRP, and partly because this is actually a really important topic. But let me explain conceptually. So network rewards are essentially the equivalent, if you like, of indexing rewards in a sense, that but what will change is there'll be certain qualifying criteria. So if you participate on the network and you're providing good quality of service, etc., then you will be eligible for a decent share of network rewards relative to your stake. If you're not providing good quality of service, you basically you will not be eligible to receive so many network rewards, and it incentivizes the network to be operating the right way rather than just milking the system. Now, the second, network payments, is strongly linked, but perhaps even more different from indexing rewards. And that for network payments, it's operating from issuance, where issuance will actually be using the same mechanisms as any other network participant could use to pay the network for things. Now, the primary thing here is indexing. So rather than the current funky formula, actually the network is able to ask indexers on the indexes to perform indexing. How much indexing they'll be asked to perform will be linked to having established a good quality of service record, and also the need of the network. As we transition to this, by the way, essentially the goal here will be to keep the amount of work that the network is doing roughly the same initially, but over the long term, as external demand grows, it'll be dictated increasingly more by external demand rather than what issuance is asking the network to do. Now, part of what we achieved through network payments is that although it will be doing the equivalent of paying indexers to perform indexing through indexing fees in this case, rather than through the current mechanism, some of this will also be used to ask the network to perform a background rate of queries so that we can measure how the network is performing from a quality of service point of view. I'll just pause there for a while. I know this is going to be a big in some ways this will be a big area of interest, particularly for anyone that's an indexer, that I will not be able to satisfy all your curiosity about today necessarily, but I do want to make sure that what I have explained makes sense so far at this high level. And I'll take it. Is that meaning no questions at that stage? Okay. We move on to the next item here. So efficiently balanced fee cuts that incentivize network value creation. So basically over here, the query fee mechanism is being changed, or I'll say, so sorry, not the query fee mechanism itself, but the way cuts get taken from query fees will changed. It'll be more dynamic in nature so that it can scale up or down according to the network need, and it'll have a bit more scope to make sure that the entire value chain can be incentivized. That includes contributors who are contributing or collaborating on the network. And just to put this into perspective, so if you like, the current protocols, yes, so it's roughly 10% cut from query fees. This cut is it's almost to me like you're looking at a clock on the wall that has stopped working, and twice per day that clock tells you the correct time. And I think fixed cuts from query fees are a little bit like a broken clock. Sometimes they're correct. Most of the time, I suspect they'll not be ideal. And with the way the proposal is being planned at the moment, there are details to be worked out. I anticipate that query fees could drop from, sorry, the cut from a query fee for a high usage module of some sort, subgraph, substream, etc., could drop as low as 2% or go as high as 50%. I suspect those are probably parameters that we'll try and keep them within. I think going over 50% starts to kind of incentivize some strange behavior because too much of a cut is taken. Less than 2% would actually allow certain attack vectors to open up on the network, because if there was no cut at all and statistics about queries are being looked at by the network, people could spoof queries at no cost and affect the network. Make sense so far? Okay. I'm now going to move on to the enhance part of the proposal. So enhancing incentive alignment. Well, the first one here is introducing a sponsor incentive that optimally matches indexing with demand. This is a little bit bringing back almost a mechanism a lot like curation, but for indexing fees. Of course, the indexing fees proposal, GIP 0081, as it stands at the moment, does not have such a cut. And that can result in positive externalities, what an economist would call it, not being captured. You can get an imbalance in the network with people free riding on indexing paid for someone else, and the network overall not being incentivized to do sufficient or the right indexing. So by reintroducing a sponsor incentive into the way indexing fees work, that allows the network to balance. And the incentive is designed, by the way, to achieve balance, it's not a mechanism through which you'll get an unending payout because you were lucky and indexed the right subgraph that is extremely popular for the next 10 years. It's actually designed as a mechanism to find the right balance between how much the cut is versus the usage and the stage in the life cycle that a data module of some form of that. So, for example, I anticipate that when you first develop a subgraph or a substream, the cut would be high because you're just doing it for yourself probably, and if someone else uses it, that's great. You know, everyone wins. But later, if you try to maintain a very high cut and the usage got very high, someone else would come and undercut you. They say, "Oh, we don't need to be taking 50% of those query fees. That's very popular. I can do it for 20% or whatever." It's designed to seek balance. I'll move on. So that's indexing fees. Now, the other thing that the sponsor mechanism enables is there's now a new way to do curation. And it's a new way that, if you like, I was talking about balance and open synergistic primitives that works in combination with these. So we've now got a way that people can sponsor indexing. Now, when you're sponsoring indexing, you're handing over GRT, right? If it costs 100 GRT to index something, you pay 100 GRT and it's indexed. Curation as an indirect sponsor is still a matter of locking GRT rather than paying GRT, right? So you lock GRT, and in return for that locking that GRT, you kind of do a little bit the equivalent of a sponsor in saying what it is you're locking the GRT for, but it's issuance that is used to do the sponsoring for you. So you don't lose that locked GRT, and in fact it becomes an interesting for the people who want to contribute to the network. It becomes there might be a caveat here, but a risk-free way of locking GRT. Now, another interesting thing here is I did say, these are open primitives. By this being an open primitive, this curation mechanism also allows curating on a space, on the knowledge graph, on a data service, on other things that we might not have thought about yet. And I think that's, there are three key things there, right? There are the key use cases that we already have are supported. There's some key use cases that we're working on to expand the utility of the graph in terms of the knowledge graph. And there are unanticipated future things that the network might do that we don't want to have to redesign the basic protocol for. And it allows all of those things to happen. It also, I think, allows us a way to incentivize, to define, build, and integrate. I will say, by the way, so everything in this contributors to build a column, right? Contribute and collaborate, space, service, module, define, build, integrate. The solutions for those are outside the scope of this proposal. That's why I haven't made them green. I've just made them not red anymore. So we'll need to independently still put proposals for the specific details of how each of those work. But we are creating a protocol platform almost, if you like, an ecosystem that allows those things to be catered for. So will curation have a fall like delegation of locking? Yes, I think it will. It would actually be possible to do it without it, because what would happen when you curate, you lock the GRT and the GRT starts accumulating over time. So you build up GRT that can be spent, if you like, over time. However, I also think if you were looking at the case of indexing, a certain amount of predictability helps all participants on the network, right? So if you curate on indexing something, the indexer would like to know that actually you're not going to turn around tomorrow and stop without warning. This also does enable another, when I said there's a caveat on the GRT being risk-free, I think the only reason I would introduce slashing for curation is if you acted in bad faith. I'm not sure how good our mechanisms would be to detect bad faith, but if you are deliberately using curation to self-serve in an inappropriate way and bypass the protocol intent. Okay, I think I've answered that question. I'll now just move on to the sustain aspects. By the way, no questions from anyone at this stage, because at this stage I'm wondering, yeah, no, I will try and leave some time free at the end. I'd hate to not give you a chance to ask questions rather than take up all the time. So, self-balancing issuance allocation based on locked GRT proportions. I mentioned before, right? We've got a number of things we want happening on the network. We want issuance to be balanced between them. Currently, of course, all of the issuance is going to indexing rewards. And we want the transition from that to be slow, particularly initially, and driven by demand, without indexes seeing, a sudden loss in compensation, right? We want stability for the network. Now, of course, if the extra demand is net new demand, so for example, a lot of people come to the graph now and say, oh, I can now curate on the knowledge graph, or I can, or some other mechanisms. That's not one of the current mechanisms. If that's net new demand, the self-balancing mechanism will mean that although, if you like, let me use an example. Let's say let's pretend issuance was 100. And if the amount of locked GRT doubled because you had a lot of people, as much GRT as is currently locked on the graph, come and join the graph and lock on the knowledge graph. What would happen, marginal supply and marginal demand, there might be a little period of smoothing, but overall what would happen is that half of the issuance would go to the knowledge graph instead of like it currently does to indexing reward. But the half of the issuance that is still going to indexing rewards still has the same value as it would otherwise have had, because we've doubled the demand and therefore the price goes up. So the self-balancing mechanism allows a quite graceful way to allow the network to grow, direct issuance to the right places, and it allows us actually a way to start doing this slowly. Because if we introduce this mechanism right now, tomorrow, based on the amount of current, the current self-stake, the current delegation, and the current curation, even presuming that all of the current curation switch to to the knowledge graph, which actually isn't the case. There'd be curation within for indexing data still. Curating for the knowledge graph is an extra use of curation, not a replacement. But even if we presumed all of that went, and some other details of how this worked that I haven't gone into, there would be a less than 1% drop in indexer income. And the reason for that is if you look at the amount of locked GRT, right, at the moment there's about 2.5 billion locked through the combination of indexer self-stake and delegation, whereas there's about 7 or 8 million, so that's million compared to billion, right? Huge difference between those and curation. By the way, the other, the next point actually deals with the other point. Any questions about that, by the way? By the way, there are also some potential. I mentioned net new demand. I'm very aware, and will be designing to mitigate and protect the transition from a scenario where we introduce this mechanism and suddenly a large chunk of existing delegators switch to curating on the knowledge graph, which would not be net new. Okay. Final part of the proposal, so taper subsidy based on external income to match network needs. And this is again about making sure we have a gradual transition, but that we do it in a transparent way, that everyone understands what's coming and everyone's incentive aligned with the growth of the network. What we don't want to do is say, okay, so up until now, all this issuance, 300 million going into indexing rewards. Oh, now we're just going to give 100 million and suddenly it goes away, right? Because that would cause instability in the network, a sudden drop. It also probably wouldn't feel fair to all participants who've supported the network from the beginning. But what we do want to do is say, well, actually that is a subsidy to get the network started. And it's a subsidy that as a network grows, it needs to migrate off. And the way you want to migrate off it is that as external income grows, the amount of issuance going into the bucket, which is currently indexing awards, but will itself migrate to network awards and network payments, from issuance gets reduced by half of the external income. So, for example, if the external income becomes 10 million, then the amount of issuance being used for that subsidy reduces by half of 10 million, so it reduces by 5 million. And what that means is that indexes are benefiting, right? They're getting more income as the network grows, while at the same time, the more issuance is becoming available for other purposes. And we are also migrating to healthier dynamics, right? As the network grows, it actually becomes unhealthy for the network for it to be distorted by too much subsidy from another source. The network becomes healthier and more incentive aligned if it's external income flowing into the network that's paying for it. And I mentioned before, as part of the self-balancing part, the overall impact is less than 1%. So this is the other part I hadn't mentioned yet. It's still within this overall 1%. Currently the external income is so low that its impact on that pool is is also very low. And so we are now in a position that we can introduce these mechanisms without there being a sudden change. We will get what seems like a trivial amount initially for other purposes, but this is actually very valuable for us. It allows us to start piloting and prototyping other mechanisms for how issuance can be used, right? Before there's a huge amount of issuance at stake. So we can make sure we can pilot those mechanisms and get them right. And it allows us also to make it possible for the network to grow in those ways and to grow in essentially in terms of the overall value and demand it's delivering for consumers. I've done a lot of talking. I'm going to briefly switch, briefly pause. Nothing here. I'll just now point that overall, remember I started with a diagram talking about the holistic coherence and balance. Now I can draw a bigger box where all of this is included in what is being made to work together and to balance through a combination of these proposals. I'm just now going to, and it might be I come back to this diagram for questions because it might be the one that's most useful, but I'll do a little bit of putting things back into context. You saw already all of these items on the left-hand side. These were the aspects. I had linked them, of course, to maintaining network balance, enhancing incentive alignment, and sustained continuous improvement. There's a very similar diagram in the GIP, by the way, for those who've read it. And there's also, I mentioned the design principles, so the synergistic open primitives. It becomes a little bit everything's connected to everything. So I do show them one at a time. It's not quite true that everything's connected to everything, but it can look like that, right? But you can see it's highly interconnected. These design principles have broad applicability. And of course, the second one was consumer value alignment. You can again see it relates to a lot of the points quite strongly, and it also feeds very strongly into almost every, in fact, in a more minor way, into all of the design proposals and define always a self-balancing market. And actually, this one does feed into every single proposal. So when you draw them together, I haven't drawn this exactly like it's in the GRP, but you can see it looks like everything is connected to everything. And that is basically me having covered all of that. All open for questions. Well, if you don't have any questions, we'll stop a few minutes early. Are the primitives ordered by the sequence of improvement? Not really. Actually, I will show you a little bit to slightly highlight that. If we just move this to the left slightly and look at each of these aspects of the proposal, each of these actually has a GRP tentatively assigned to it that hasn't yet been published, but we're thinking about, right? So the first one, migrating from indexing rewards to network payments and network rewards. Second one, network payment cut framework to incentivize centralized value creation. You can see these all strongly correlated to the point they're next to. Third, embed incentives for sponsors of capability building to balance supply. The fourth one, curation as an indirect sponsor that allocates issuance for capability building. And here actually there's a little reversal in ordering due to changes that happened while I was authoring, but the GRP 76 is intended to be about implementing upgraded curation and distribute issuance based on locked GRT. and 75 is a tapered subsidy. I actually think we're going to do 76 first, because 76 allows us, so this is implementing the upgraded curation and particularly the distributes the issuance based on locked GRT, because this one allows us to decouple the implementation aspects and start piloting things, start doing things for the knowledge graph on one track, start doing things with the way indexing payments work on another track, etc. So I think the answer then to your question, Hope, is that the way the order they appeared on the screen is not really necessarily the order of implementation. But I think the order of implementation will be a little bit overlapping. So I think once we start doing the distributing issuance based on locked GRT, some of the mechanisms, like for GRP 71, for example, I think we'll first implement some pilots for that while it's a small amount, and we'll do some testing and iteration on that, right? It'll still be tested and validated and refined over time. So they won't then really be done in order. Hopefully we'll be able to focus tracks individually on realizing the maximum value in each track, really. Hopefully that answers the question, rather long-winded way. So do I have any thoughts on issuance with locked GRT voting power? Maybe just rephrasing signaling. So this is actually an interesting question. So let me probably go back to this diagram. So I talked about this new curation mechanism, and I told you how when you lock the GRT to curate, you get a share of the issuance gets directed by what you lock. It is also a signal, though, and I think this is important. It's important because other network mechanisms to do with network payments and network rewards, for example, need to have a signal, right? They need some input to decide which subgraphs, substreams, etc., are worth indexing. And really, the only way to get that signal is if someone has skin in the game. There's no way of manufacturing such a signal other than actually having someone give up something of value, in this case, locking GRT. But those mechanisms may well operate at a multiple of the signal, right? They might say, well, if you curate one as the issuance, as a mechanism distributing the issuance, I might be happy to distribute 100 in response to a signal of one. I don't know what that ratio will be, but you can see that the potential of having a signal is still a very important concept.
Yeah, thanks, Hope. You mentioned on the tapering mechanism that, I'm checking my notes, that yeah, the goal is to the amount of issuance will be used to subsidize indexed income, which will adds gradually, like it decreases as external income or from consumer payments increases, right? But I think in the GIP, I'm not sure if you mentioned on the slide, I was looking for it, but I think you mentioned the indexed income target that should
Yes.
help determining the level of subsidy needed. So can you briefly explain what that might be, or will that only be covered in future GIPs?
So I don't know the detail of that yet, but what I can say that is in the analysis so far, there needs to be some peg to an external basis, a fiat currency. If there isn't some form of external basis for what that target is, you can get into a cycle where the subsidy never goes away, because all that's happening is the amount of GRT might be going down, but its value just goes up. So the subsidy mechanism, the subsidy wouldn't be tapered off over time. So there needs to be an external basis. And this is probably one of the, it might be one of the hardest things to actually figure out from that particular proposal when it comes. At what level do we set it? And personally, I suspect, and I don't want to commit to any particular basis, but we're probably going to try and find some neutral basis that's not that avoids pitting the different people involved in the debate against each other too much as a negotiation, and can be seen more as, okay, that's a fair way of setting it.
Thanks, Ram. While I'm waiting for someone to post something in the chat, Ram, you did bring up knowledge graphs, right? Quite a bit during the presentation. I don't think we've ever covered knowledge graphs in the scope of this CoreDev call, so that is also something that we'll indeed address and cover very, very soon. So stay tuned. It will make more sense very, very soon. Pili is asking, which are the next steps with this proposal? Awesome. Thanks, Pili.
Yeah, so basically take it through the governance process, make sure that it's approved. It's a little bit different from most GIPs because it's not an implementation of anything. Nevertheless, it's a very important agreement in principle on where we're going. So we get it through the governance process, make sure we have broad support for it. And then, of course, more detail needs to go into all the individual pieces, because I think one of the key purposes of publishing this is that when subsequent proposals come out, those proposals can be assessed in the context of where we're going, rather than just being looked at as an isolated proposal.
So folks, if you do have more feedback, and I know there's a lot here, so do take the time to read the GIP. Thanks for those who posted the links in the chat. It's also on the forum. Just look for GIP 70. Do participate. Again, to Ram's point, we do need your feedback. We need support before we move it to the council, so we can then proceed with the research on what mechanism should be changed and how. We don't want to change it halfway, so your feedback is important now. Again, forums, GitHub, everywhere. And also in exit office hours, I believe, Rem, you're also going to, or you went already to in exit office hours to hear mainly from indexers, correct? Okay, so
yes,
that's perfect. This will also be uploaded to YouTube if you want to recap. Just look for CoreDev Call, the graph on YouTube, and a playlist should appear. We'll also have meeting notes on the forum, and that is it. I think we should wrap it up here, Ram, because we're already 3 minutes over. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for your questions. Again, continue the conversation on the forum. Ram, thanks so much for your time. Again, looking forward for more details on the subsequent GIPs. You're always welcome here. And I'll see you all in a month. Well, not actually a month. There will be another CoreDev call in about 2 weeks where we'll be talking about the knowledge graph, hopefully. So I'll see you all there. Take care.
Thank you. Bye for now.
Thanks, Ryan.